flexor series, and if you're watching this, you should have already gone through the first 3 assessments in part 1 of this series. And the 3 assessments were basically to determine whether or not your back pain or your anterior pelvic tilt is being caused by hip flexor tightness. So some of the questions that I get are from people asking, should I stretch my hip flexors out? They're doing stretches and not getting results. They're not really sure, do I have tight hip flexors or weak hip flexors? What's going on? So I just want to address that real quick and bring up some key points here. So something that's really important to understand, when you look at the psoas, right, the hip flexors, the psoas tends to be, it's what's referred to as it's a postural muscle, right? So a tonic type muscle. And so what these muscles do is they're very involved in helping to maintain posture. And it's not only the hip flexors and the lumbar extensors. So these are 2 key muscle groups that tend to cause a lot of not only anterior pelvic tilt, but lower back problems for most people. So when you have tonic muscles, what they do is tonic muscles tend to get short and tight rather than long and weak, right? There's other muscles that we have in our body that typically get long and weak, but the hip flexors and the lumbar extensors are not those types of muscles. So when you have these issues going on, typically what you're going to do when you address hip flexors from a flexibility standpoint is you're going to stretch them, right? They're going to need to be stretched. The same is true for the lumbar extensors. They need to be stretched. Now, another key issue, and this gets a bit deeper than just the physical stuff. So I've said this before in some of my other videos. I'm going to say it again because I believe it is absolutely so important, and it's something you really need to consider because it affects so many people, particularly with lumbopelvic dysfunction, back pain, and things like that. But basically, when we get physical manifestations of pain, when things start to happen, we get these kind of aches and pains and nagging recurring injuries that go on. What a lot of times what's going on is this is kind of the end destination. And what I mean by that is that you can go for periods of months or years without any physical signs of pain, but that process has been set in motion emotionally by what's going on with you, because basically it's just energy that's going on within you that hasn't yet presented itself until it becomes significant. When it becomes significant, it builds up enough, then it starts to manifest itself physically, and that's where we start to get the physical signs of pain. So from just thinking about this in energy standpoint, you really have to consider how stress is affecting you. When we get issues with hip flexor tightness and various kinds of pains in the lower back region and in the hip region, you have to look at things like stress, how stress is affecting you. Some key things that you can consider are stresses that involve you emotionally, mental stresses, being worried about finances, being worried or dealing with a lot of pressure on the job, right? Having arguments with family members, friends, or your spouse, or whatever it might be. Stress is huge, and here's why. The more stressed out that you are, the more stress you take on. Stress, basically, we all have our own individual capacity for how much of it we can handle, and it differs from person to person. So what stresses you out for another person wouldn't even faze them. We're all different. But every stress that you take on, it accumulates within you and builds up and builds up and builds up. Now, when you accumulate enough stress and you get pushed above your threshold, which let me tell you, in this day and age, with the fast-paced lives and all the high-pressure crap that we're dealing with in our lives, all the junk that we're eating in our diets, all the how tired we get and all the caffeine we're putting in ourselves and processed foods and all this other stuff that's going on in our environment, in our lives, it creates a ton of stress. Now, you might recognize a lot of the stress you take on, but a lot of the stress you take on, you're probably not recognizing, and a lot of people don't until we get driven over that threshold, and most people are constantly over that threshold without even knowing about it. So here's what starts to happen. Your adrenal glands get tired because whenever you get stressed out, your body's pumping out cortisol, right? So your adrenal glands are just pumping out all this cortisol, and after a while, when they keep having to do it, they get exhausted. They just get tired and they can't do it anymore. So here's where it gets important, like really important, because if you have your adrenal glands that sit on top of your kidneys, and if they get tired because they're pumping cortisol out all the time, they need a recovery period. So if you get a case where you've got, maybe you've got some weakness in the muscles around your hips, or your kidneys need to rejuvenate, that's going to take priority over any of the muscles in the area. Okay, so basically you've got an organ that's competing for nutrition against muscles. And any time that you have that kind of competition going on, well, you can live with a strained hip flexor, right? You can live if you tear your hip flexor. But if you tried to live without a kidney, you wouldn't last very long, because you can't do well without your organs. So what I'm saying is that your organs, they are the command center. Your muscles are basically slaves to the organs. So when there's a priority to be met, muscles or organs win out, and you can create muscle dysfunction and have all kinds of issues like back pain and all these other problems that exist just from something like chronic stress. Okay, so that's a key concept that I want to consider, because a lot of time the only thing that we think about is, what exercise do I do? What stretches do I do? We tend to relate everything with exercise, and maybe a little bit of diet for that matter, but that's where it stops with most of us. And it's such a key thing to understand, that a lot of these issues, they can't always be resolved with just diet or just exercise. A lot of times we have to go deeper and really assess where the true cause is coming from. That way, if you can address the cause, if you identify it and address the cause, the symptoms will resolve themselves and they won't come back. But when we're trying to simply manage the symptoms of the problems we have, well, it doesn't work very well. It's temporary at best, any kind of relief that we might get, and it tends not to last long. That's why we get cases of injuries, like back problems, that come and go. We treat the symptoms, and for a little while it gets better, but then after a while it comes back. Or we get other types of injuries that start to happen that we think are not related, but they are. It's just a growing list, one after the other after the other. All right? So some important things to remember. So that's it for part 2. Now I'm going to get into part 3 in the next video, and I'm going to get a little bit, where's my cheat sheet here? I'm forgetting what I'm talking about. Squatting. Let's talk about squatting. We're going to talk about also exercises to activate the hip muscles. So a lot of times we have hip muscles that are weak, particularly the glutes and the hamstrings are weak in these cases of hip flexor tightness, along with the abdominal muscles. So what I'm going to teach you is how to activate those muscles, and squatting is one of the big things, because a lot of people have problems with squatting. They can do it, but they don't get the right muscles involved. And a lot of times, the exercises like squatting and a lot of the posterior chain exercises that we use to fix the problem, like back pain, to fix anterior pelvic tilt, well, they're actually making the problem worse, because we're not getting to the right muscles that we need. We're just assuming that because we're doing an exercise, we're working those muscles. So that's what we're going to get into in the next video in part 3. So hopefully you can digest that information a little bit, think about it, make sense out of it a little bit, and then stay tuned and come back for part 3.